Let's continue Unit 2 on colonization with Lesson 4, Colonial Regions. A quick look at our TEKs. We want to be able to locate the New England, Middle, and Southern colonial regions. We want to be able to analyze and compare the colonial regions by their physical and human characteristics and economic differences, so we'll define what those mean. We want to look at how the environment of each region determined where people lived and how they made their money in the 16 and 1700s. And finally, we want to analyze the causes and effects of economic differences between the regions. So between 1607 and 1732, remember 1607 is the founding of Virginia and Jamestown, and 1732 the founding of Georgia, Great Britain established 13 colonies on the Atlantic coast of North America. And these are organized into three major regions, with the Backcountry, which we will talk about later on, and we're talking by this area here, running along the western borders. So first of all, we need to define what makes a region. In this case, we're talking about physical and human geography. Now, the physical geography is the land itself before people even arrived. The landforms, mountains, valleys, hills. What's the land like? Plants and animals. What animals and plants are native to that area? Waterways, lakes, rivers, harbors. The natural resources, and of course the climate. Is it warm, hot? What's cold? What's the weather like over a long period of time? And then, of course, human geography is what people bring to the area and how they live there. So we're talking about the economy. How do they make a living and support themselves? Their culture and the religion. What are their beliefs and practices? And government. How do they organize and rule themselves? So the first region we're going to look at is New England. This is the one farthest north. That consists of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. And if we look at these dates, we can see that the New England area was one of the first regions that was founded by the English colonists. Now, looking at its physical geography, it has a cold climate because, of course, it's farther north. The soil was rocky. It doesn't mean you couldn't farm there, but it wasn't good for large commercial crops and large commercial farming and cash crops. They did, however, have very dense forests, plenty of rivers, and, of course, the all-important deep ocean harbors. So the economy of a region responds to its physical geography. You make money with what you have. So the economy of the New England region was based on fishing, because of course we're on the coast, lumber, the availability of large forests, shipbuilding, which combined the first two, the availability of lumber and the coastal areas, and of course trade, shipping, and with other countries. We've talked about the Puritans before as a religious group and the importance of the Puritans to religious freedom. But the Puritan beliefs influenced not just religion, but also the culture and economy and the government of New England. Many of the colonists were English Puritans, or at least related or descended from those. They did have family farms and mostly small businesses. They didn't have a lot of servants or slaves. That's going to be in another region we'll talk about soon. And they established what we refer to as the Puritan work ethic. As part of their religious duty and part of their religious practice, they taught that everybody must work hard, do not waste, don't indulge yourself. And so the result of this is a community of very hardworking, very practical people. They governed themselves through town meetings as their main form of self-government, and they also elected representatives to serve in colonial assemblies. Our next region is the Middle Colonies, and we call them that because, well, they're sitting in the middle. Here we have New York, which was actually claimed by Britain in 1664, but founded earlier, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, which is another one claimed by Britain. Now, the physical geography, they had rich, fertile soil. They did have some forests, so not as densely as, say, New England. A number of rivers and streams, and the weather tended to be more moderate, not as cold, but not as warm as in the south. The predominant economy during the colonial times were the grain farms and mills, rye, wheat, barley, things of this sort, and so the middle colonies were often called the breadbasket. They were called this because they provided many of the grains both to the other colonies and also for trade with Europe. They did have a number of important port cities. The two most important are Philadelphia and New York City. The Middle Colonies was a diverse region. Diverse means having lots of variety. And we already mentioned part of this was because two of the colonies in the Middle Colonies were originally founded by other countries. New Amsterdam was founded by the Dutch and was taken over and became New York. Delaware was founded by the Swedes, so both of these populations could be found in the middle colonies. They also had a number of German and Scots-Irish settlers move to this area. So if we look at this pie graph in 1750, we see that while the largest group, that's in blue, were still Englishmen, that over half of the population of the middle colonies were made up of groups other than English. Pennsylvania was a colony founded for the Quakers, which was a religious minority, much as the Puritans and Pilgrims had been, founded by William Penn. And the Quakers believed in religious tolerance and accepted diversity. They believed in equal rights for women and better treatment for the Native Americans. And I guess our easiest way to recognize Quakers is, of course, the symbol of the Quaker man on Quaker oats here. But overall, the middle colonies had religious and cultural diversity and were more tolerant of each other. They were governed by royal governors appointed by the king, but also had elected assemblies just like in New England. And finally, the southern colonies. This was the largest of the colonial regions, made up of Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. We can think of Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina as the upper southern colonies, and South Carolina and Georgia as the lower southern colonies. The physical geography was of rich, fertile soil, forest along the Appalachian region, which we'll talk about with the backcountry. The South had a warm, humid climate and a long growing season, so the South was ideally suited for farming. And particularly, this led to the raising of cash crops that were raised on large plantations, so the establishing of a plantation economy. The upper southern colonies raised a lot of tobacco, while the lower ones, South Carolina and Georgia, raised rice and indigo, which was a flower that could be made into a dye that was used for a number of purposes. Now in the South, we see a split society, whereas in New England, there was more or less relative equality, I should say. In the South, we have a very split society between the wealthy landowners who were really living more like the English nobles back home in England. They had large mansions. They wore fancy European clothes like we see here. They hired private tutors for their children. They weren't concerned with public schooling. Some of them were still small middle-class farmers, and the dominant religion was Anglican, just as it had been in England, and most of the colonies had the Church of England, Anglican Church, as their state church. However, we also see the growth of slavery in the South as Europe demands more and more cash crops, and the plantation economies of the South boom. The slaves were forced to work in harsh conditions. They were purchased at auctions, and many of them were still being shipped. This time, slaves are still being shipped over from Africa. And the slaves were considered property. They had no rights as human beings, and certainly no civil rights. And finally, we have the backcountry, which really is not so much of a separate region as much as a kind of a back area of the middle and southern colonies. The backcountry was located along the edge of the Appalachian Mountains, which forms a barrier for the English colonies to the rest of North America. It was hard for the people who lived here to reach the coast in order to trade, so they tended to be more independent. They made homemade goods, they built their homes out of logs, they made log cabins. The soil wasn't very great, so they tended to hunt more for food. And they had kind of an independent spirit because they were farther away from government, and they tended to reject government control and government regulation over their lives. So our Lesson 4 thoughts about Lesson 4. How did the physical geography of the three main colonial regions affect the economic activities in each? So there we want to think about how does where you live and what the environment's like affect the way you make a living, because it's always going to do that. Number 2, how did the social characteristics of each region affect its economic choices? So compare, for example, the Puritans in New England to the slaveholders in the South. Finally, if you had been a colonist, which region do you think you would choose to live in, and explain your choice? So after you looked at these, which one do you think would suit you best? Well, that concludes Lesson 4, and our next lesson will be on the foundations of colonial government. We'll see you then.